let me welcome Michael Brown, who until a few days ago was the head of the DIU, the Defense Innovation Unit. And Michael, thank you very much for joining us here today, and same to all the participants.
Happy to be with you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's our pleasure. I think we've all been watching modern warfare every day on CNN. We're seeing how advances in technology can shift the outcomes of wars. And as I said to Mike a few minutes ago, you're concerned about America and what are these new cyber powers around the world? What impact will they have? We, of course, have had advanced military capability along with our allies and an ally like Israel, which has, kept us out of trouble. But when you get to cyber warfare, there's a lot of countries that have that ability or can gain that ability quite easily. What will it do to our capability? How does it shift our capability? And is this something that we need to worry about? So we've got a lot more questions, but that's sort of the basic premise of why the American Jewish Congress is following up on this and what we want to talk about over here. So I know, Mike, you want to give a presentation, and then we can get into some Q&A, so I won't take up anyone's time. So the floor is yours right now.
Okay, well, Jack, thanks very much for that. Yeah, I will start by thanking you and complimenting you on taking an interest here, because warfare is changing, and I feel like the American public needs to understand how fast that's changing and how important commercial technology is to our warfighting capability. We understand, the kinetic effect, the bombs, the missiles that we produce are important, but your points are spot on. We're now fighting in some domains we hadn't before. Cyber, we may fight in the future in space, which was an uncontested domain, and commercial technology is really what's developing and advancing in those two domains and many others. So we see that commercial capabilities are changing the character of warfare, and you only need to look as far as Ukraine to see that happening right before our eyes. When can you imagine that a country would be calling on an individual and a company, Elon Musk and Starlink, to increase its communications capability and help defend itself? That hasn't happened in history before, but I think you're going to see more of that in the future. So yeah, I'd like to spend a couple of minutes talking about DIU, what we do, and the importance of commercial technology. So we prepared this brief presentation, and I'm going to try and go through it fairly quickly with you here. So if we go to the next slide. The Defense Innovation Unit was really set up 7 years ago by then Secretary Ash Carter to bring in more commercial technology into the military and accelerate that process. So why did he think that was important? Well, first, we see China here, which is our pacing adversary. We've moved on from a moment when we won the Cold War and we didn't think we had to spend as much in defense, to now a period where the world has presented itself again as a dangerous place, with Russia and China trying to exert their will, both authoritarian regimes. And the National Defense Strategy recognizes that it's not going to be the case that we're going to have a technology and our adversaries don't, or if that exists, it doesn't exist for very long. We've had that in our history. We had that when we first developed nuclear weapons. Then through espionage, the Russians, the Soviets got access to that. And we had that also in the first Gulf War, where we brought amazing new technology through satellite communications, laser-guided munitions, night vision, and several other technologies that really gave us a quite superior fighting force relative to the Iraqis, the sixth largest army in the world we defeated in a matter of days with almost no casualties. That's because of technology. But technology diffuses around the world. So it's probably unlikely that we're going to have a period, especially relative to Russia or China, where we have something and they don't. So the defense strategies recognize that we have to be agile. We may not have the technology first. Hypersonics, we had it first. The Chinese are further along in developing it. But integrating that and adapting it, meaning new concepts of operations that use that technology might be the key to winning a future conflict. I listed 8 what I'll call game-changing technologies here, and I'm sure these are familiar to you. Only one of those is not being pioneered by the commercial market. That's hypersonics, which is, for those who don't know, that's a missile or plane that travels at Mach 5 or faster. So basically something traveling at, 4,000 miles per hour or faster. So all of the other technologies are being led by the commercial world. So if we don't have access to the leading technology, which often comes from small companies, not defense contractors, then we're going to be behind. And even worse, because it's commercial technology, our adversaries might gain access to this technology before the US does. So we have to be much more agile. We've got to be modernizing the Defense Department using this commercial technology. And again, that's why DIU was set up 7 years ago. If we move on to the next slide, it's comments from Chairman Xi, the head of the Communist Party, who's now made it possible for himself to serve as a lifetime dictator. And he's talking about the importance of technology here. His quote, "We should establish ourselves as one of the most innovative countries by 2020. I think he's accomplished that. And a leading innovator by 2030, which means not second to the US. He basically wants to be the technology superpower, the position the US has enjoyed, and make sure that happens by the 100th anniversary of the founding of the PRC in 2049. A couple of things in this. One, the importance of technology. We don't have a similar statement from our government about the importance of technology, the importance of leading and what that's going to take from an investment standpoint, maybe thinking about industrial policy, not to pick winners and losers, but to think about how do we make sure sectors are important and we're leading in those, like the ones I just showed on the previous slide, AI, cyber, biotech. We should be enabling the US and its allies to lead in those spaces. If we don't, he's ready to step in, make sure that China is leading, setting standards for the world, not just products. There's a saying that in China, third-rate companies develop products, second-rate companies develop industry standards. I'm sorry, second-rate are leaders in their industry, and first-rate develop standards, meaning recognizing the importance of being so far out in front that you're setting the pace for others to fill in. Very focused on technology for 2 reasons in China. Number one, that helps China control its population. Thank goodness we don't live in a society where technology is being used to surround us as a police state. China has taken that to the extreme that George Orwell would be envious. It's phenomenal and scary as hell what they're doing with technology to control their population. And the second is, she recognizes that technology is a key to having high-paying jobs and growth in their economy. And nothing could be more important to making sure that the Communist Party stays in power than ensuring that economy continues to grow. I think you could say easily that we're competing with China in these 4 dimensions: economically, geopolitically, ideologically, and militarily. In fact, the only dimension that we're not actually at war today with China is militarily. These other dimensions, they're using every power available to the government to make sure that they are prevailing. And this will give you some of the dimensions here. So in economics, they basically have employed what we call techno-nationalism, which is they make sure that they are leading in certain technologies, and they do that through an industrial policy that makes sure that the government is investing. As an example, they're investing $150 billion right now so that they can produce more semiconductors that will fuel their position as the world's largest electronics manufacturer. So 70% of the world's electronic goods are manufactured in China today, but only about 15% of the chips used in those products are Chinese. That means they're importing from the US, from South Korea, from Japan, and other countries. Their goal, through an explicit document they've created called Made in China 2025, is for that 15% to be 70%. I don't know if they'll get there, but that is the goal that they have in their investing to make that the case. They do not, before we go on a few other points, they do not compete fairly. We let them into the WTO so that they could develop their economy further and hopefully sign up to the system we put in place since World War II to keep the world safer. A lot of the institutions like the IMF, like the WTO, but they don't play by the same rules. And they basically say, come stop us if you want to change our behavior. But they have no intention of basically free trade that benefits both sides. They subsidize their industries and want to make sure that their companies that are leading in industry have more than a fair advantage. They've done that with Huawei and ZTE with 5G technology. 5G represents just the tip of the iceberg on what they'd like to do, because they have about 10 or 15 industries, AI, advanced satellites, high performance computing, et cetera, where they want to be leading. Geopolitically, they have the most ambitious program to ensure that their economy benefits from interaction with the world that's ever been seen. It's called the Belt and Road Initiative, or One Belt, One Road. It's been called both of those. And it basically is a form of economic colonialism. The idea is they will establish these trade routes, which include ownership of ports, digital and physical infrastructure to understand the trade flows and make sure that the Chinese are the ones supplying goods to countries that are subscribing to Belt and Road, often fueled by debt. It's a bargain where developing countries will pick up debt, and in many cases it's prohibitively expensive, like a significant part of that country's GDP. Then when the countries can't pay back that debt, the Chinese go and take ownership. There's a port in Greece, Piraeus, which is partially owned by the Chinese. There's another one in Sri Lanka. They envision setting up a series of these ports and doing the development projects that basically puts those countries in debt to China, and then they can exercise economic coercion. Meaning, if you don't do what we want politically, we will create economic disincentives for you. They've done that with Australia as an example, where the Australians want free and open trade, and where exports to China is 7% of the Australian economy, and then they can now threaten it. We'll shut you down, Australia, if you don't basically toe the line on what we want to do politically. And Xi has been very vocal that he wants Asia to be run by Asians. That means not the US. So basically stay out of our sphere of influence, which extends across the Pacific. Ideologically, because they're a communist power, they employ a government propaganda machine that includes folks on social media paid by the government to influence what happens in social media. They want to control the Chinese diaspora around the world. There's penalties for Chinese students studying in the US who might say something counter. So if you thought their actions against the NBA were problematic when the Rockets manager talked about the Uyghurs, what they do to Chinese citizens who are around the world is much worse. There's something you can Google called document number 9, which is a leaked document from the Communist Party that talks about the freedoms we enjoy in the West are existential threats to their remaining in power, like freedom of speech, freedom to assemble. And then militarily, they are engaged in the most rapid militarization that the world has ever seen. So they're increasing their spending to rapidly modernize their capability. And we've all read about that. They're launching of aircraft carriers, designs they've stolen of large weapons platforms like our fighter aircraft that now they're producing. And they're basically also investing in asymmetric capabilities that deny the ability of our aircraft carriers to be close to their shore. So anti-ship ballistic missiles that use AI to be able to basically neutralize any advantage we would bring. They also coerce or compel their commercial industries to work with the military. So every commercial advancement is available through a military civil fusion strategy. It's available to the PLA or the Chinese military to upgrade. It's a pretty powerful set of policies that they put in place to advance themselves in technology, make sure their military gets modernized, and control their population. So that's the backdrop. We're in a long-term competition with China, and I worry very much if we don't keep up technologically their ability to exert themselves first in the Pacific, and later you can imagine that they might have even larger ambitions. So it's critically important that we modernize our own military and keep pace with some of these technology developments occurring. Well, let's leave China as a backdrop. To me, that really is the sense of urgency we need to have in the US, and talk a little bit about Ukraine. And then we'll talk where we are at DIU. So Ukraine is as we were just saying, really presents the opportunity to see commercial technology in action. So what we see is Ukraine being cloud covered. When Putin launched the invasion in February, Ukraine is covered in clouds most of the time. That makes it difficult to see with satellite imagery what's happening there. Although we've pioneered a different type of imagery, it's radar imagery, so synthetic aperture radar, which allows you to see through clouds and at night. That was being developed commercially, not initially by the military. On the right, you've got satellite images. These are more traditional optical images. One of the things that's happening is there are more and more commercial satellites that are being launched. We're used to the fact that there are government satellites, and a couple of those. That started with the Sputnik era, the year I was born. But they haven't proliferated to great numbers because they have exquisite capabilities and are super expensive. Now we're seeing lower cost, what are called CubeSats, kind of the suitcase size form factor. And by the end of this decade, it's expected that there can be 1,000 commercial satellites for every government satellite. So in terms of situational awareness, the ability to see what's happening around the world, commercial satellites are going to be where it's at. That's going to give us much closer to real-time capability. If we go to the next slide, we can start to see some, I'm sorry, we don't see there, but the fact that these radar images allow us to see through clouds at night, and we're a game changer on the ground in Ukraine for not only sharing with our allies and partners, but also sharing with the Ukrainians for tactical advantages. That's how we could see those tank convoys and, the truck convoys and tanks, and the Ukrainians are able to see exactly where the Russian forces are amassed. So critical technology coming from the commercial sector, game-changing in terms of military capability. Well, let's talk a little bit about DIU. So DIU brought that technology to the military. We started providing the contracts to the initial vendors. Here's what DIU looks like today. It's 3 different organizations that allow us to work with technologies at different stages or different maturity levels. That's on the horizontal axis. On the vertical axis, you can see the different players that are involved in the national security innovation base, that's NSIB, in an ecosystem. And it's everything from the academic community at the lower left, all the way to traditional defense industrial base, Northrop Grumman, Boeing, Raytheon, our traditional defense contractors. What the defense strategy recognizes by coining this term, national security innovation bases, we need the capability across the spectrum. There's things that the Northrop Grummans or Boeings can do that no one else can do. We need them, but we also need non-traditional vendors, the investors, early stage companies involved, and incubators and accelerators, because commercial technology is going to be more critical in the future. And where do we go to get that commercial technology? Well, it's all of these sources. It's not going to be delivered through the traditional defense primes. So the original Core Defense Innovation Unit is working with companies that have prototypes developed. We can test those prototypes and get them into production. Further upstream, we have our own small venture capital arm to focus on hardware vendors. Turns out our venture capital industry does a great job with software. That makes sense from a financial standpoint. It's low capital to develop software. There's plenty of tools involved. Very few people can do it. So it's very efficient from a capital standpoint, return on invested capital. Venture capital industry funds that to a great degree. But if you're developing something using a quantum sensor, a new battery chemistry, hypersonic materials, that's tougher to come by venture capital. So the government needs to step in there and supplement and provide the signal that, that we need to develop those suppliers. Further upstream is National Security Innovation Network. That's our connection to the academic community. 70 universities, accelerators, incubators we're working with to develop ideas that can become future vendors. The Hacking for Defense course, if you're familiar with that, several vendors, including the primary supplier for synthetic aperture radar, Capella Space, a San Francisco-based startup that developed that, came from a Hacking for Defense course. That means their founders were sitting around a classroom at Stanford University saying, we understand the problem of wanting to understand situational awareness better. We've got a technology that can help with that, and they formed a company. So out of the class, we mostly get a greater awareness of what national security problems are. Sometimes we get people who want to support the national security enterprise. Sometimes we even get vendors. So that's the combination of organizations at DIU and how we're working together to basically support innovation coming to defense across that spectrum of different maturity ideas, from concept and idea all the way to companies that have a solution we can test. So we're going to talk for the rest of this talk about the organization that was in the upper right, the project-based part of DIU. So again, set up by Ash Carter 7 years ago. The idea is to move at commercial speeds. That's what fast moving means. Work across DoD, so we're not working just for the Air Force or the Navy, but solutions that go across. And if you think about it, commercial technologies already go across. If we're thinking about these small handheld quadcopters or small drones, which is what this soldier is holding, that wasn't developed for the Navy versus the Air Force or the Army. It's developed as a commercial capability initially and can be used by all those forces. So that's where DIU comes to play a role. Ash Carter developed DIU, and I say that the term innovation is a little bit confusing. If we go back to the last slide, that really should have been Defense Commercial Technology Unit. That's really what we're doing. So if you can go back to the previous slide, the mission consists of 3 parts: accelerating commercial adoption. Second, what can we work on that's transforming military capabilities? This really came from Secretary Mattis. He wanted us to work on the big things. So that's why the word transform is there. And then those 3 organizations are all aimed at strengthening that national security innovation base, or how do we draw on more than just the defense prime? What we've done to make that a reality is these 3 things. We have a unique process that makes it easy for commercial companies to interact with DoD. We call it Commercial Solutions Opening. It's basically a commercial process that's different from the federal acquisition regulations. The second is we have invested in having people from every branch of the military so we understand the problems that the military has. We're not just acting as an intermediary. And then third, maybe most important, we have a continuous scouting function that allows us to see what the commercial world is developing at any point in time, and relationships with the investors to know about the companies they're funding and may not yet be public with their plans. So we really want to understand what's possible commercially so that we can present that to the military. So that comes from understanding the market on an ongoing basis, not just getting a problem and then saying, I wonder who might have something for us there. So if we go to the next slide, we're focused in these 6 technology areas. We call them portfolios. And if you think about it, these are areas where the commercial market is leading and the rate of product introduction is happening much faster than the military is used to. The newest one for us is energy. It's about a 2-year-old portfolio. This is about resilience of energy supply, conservation of energy, and looking at synthetic or alternative fuel sources. So the DoD is the world's largest energy consumer. So to make progress on making the force more resilient, meaning you can go further on a given amount of input, energy input, and to solve the problems we see with climate change, DoD must be involved in what we're doing to modernize the force from an energy standpoint. Let's go to the next slide. So here's that process. I'm not going to cover it in detail with you, but just tell you a couple of things about it. If you know anything about military acquisition, you know it starts with requirements. That means we tell the commercial market what to build. We don't need that for commercial solutions, so we don't start with that. We just start with a problem. This process is designed to maximize competition. So you can see this inverted pyramid, the number of players who can participate at each stage of the process. So we might start with more than 100 vendors because we make it easy for them to respond to a solicitation or a problem that we would put out. That means just a white paper or slide presentation they would supply to any commercial customer. So that allows us to maximize competition and minimize the vendor opportunity cost to participate. Then we go through a down select process with the idea of getting companies on contract with the government in 60 to 90 days. That's lightning fast for the government. It's commercial speed. With those companies that go on contract, might be 1 to 5. We'll do a bake-off. That's what I call more than one, is a bake-off of somebody's technology. There we're testing it in a military environment. How well does it work when it's has to be meeting some specifications that are different from what companies would face in the commercial world. And the idea is the winner of that bake-off will go to a production contract. So they've gone through the testing phase we call prototyping, not because the technology is not mature, but prototyping in a military environment. And when they go to that transition, we can immediately put them on contract. They can scale up. They don't have to recompete. So without going through a lot of detail, that's very different than how the federal acquisitions regulations process works. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So part of it is our process. Here's some figures that kind of get you in touch with the scale of DIU. We now have more than 100 projects underway, When I started 4 years ago leading DIU, we just had a few dozen. So we've scaled up 51 completed projects. So transition of capabilities to the warfighters. Best thing about us is we're leveraging other people's money. So this is leveraging $23 billion of private capital, mostly venture capital, rather than taxpayer dollars to get this capability to the military. So that's the venture investment in the companies that we're working with. 100 vendors introduced to DoD. First-time vendors, meaning we make it easy enough for first-time vendors to come on board. You can see we also have made it possible for 277 companies to do some business with the Department of Defense in addition to that, or that I think the 277 includes the 105. Moving at very fast speed. One thing we're proud of is the transition rates. The ability to take a project from an idea to getting a capability in warfighters' hands is almost 50%. If you're familiar with other programs like the SBIR grants, those are closer to a 10% transition. So we're almost to the point where most of what we start on ends up in a warfighter's hands. That's our ultimate measure of success. Not how many projects we're working on, not whether we did a demonstration or experiment, what got in a warfighter's hands to make their lives better. The money we obligate for prototypes comes from the DoD partner we work with. So this isn't our budget of $1 billion. This is the Army, Navy, Air Force saying, this is a problem I want to solve, and they're providing the money that goes to the vendors to solve those problems. Let's go to the next slide. Pretty geographically distributed. So all of the states, but 3 have provided proposals to DIU. All of those in dark blue are 31 states, have companies within them that have won DIU awards. And you can see quite a few international countries here as well. Allies, of course, we do business with Russia or China. And of course, you notably see Israel there as well. Let's go to the next slide. So we just spent a minute on some of the capabilities that we've delivered. We go to the next slide. Sail drone here is one of those. That's a autonomous sailing vessel, solar powered. You can put any sensor package on that, and that sails around the water to give you capability where you wouldn't send a manned ship. I know you as a group are particularly interested in cyber, so I'll give you an example here. One of the big problems that General Nakasone has, who leads U.S. Cyber Command, is that we have to protect the network of the Defense Department. It's called the DoDIN, the Department of Defense Information Network. And the problem here was, how can you protect that network if you don't even know what's on it? This is a commercial problem that's been solved. So we call it asset inventory management, where you can basically deploy a piece of software that tells you all of the devices that are hung on the network. You can imagine how difficult that is for the Department of Defense. But this allows you to do that in an automated way rather than imagine IT administrators walking around asking people, what devices do you have? This tells you that automatically. And the second part of this was, how do we patch the level of software that's on all those devices? One of the biggest problems in cyber protection is making sure that the current software that protects you against the cyber vulnerabilities is deployed. So part 1 was what's on the network. Part 2 is making sure all those devices have up-to-date software. One of the biggest factors that you'll hear about discussed among cyber experts to protect yourself. It's called cyber hygiene. You got to make sure you've got the latest patches. Let's go to the next slide. So just summing up my perspective, having just led 4 years at DIU. As an experiment, which is how it was set up by Ash Carter, I think we've succeeded in the mission. You can see here again some stats, number of projects, and leveraging outside investment. We have shown that we can not only do this, but we can scale it. We can go from a few dozen projects to now 100 projects underway. I don't think the Department of Defense is sufficiently focused on the point I've made repeatedly. Commercial technology can be increasingly important. So how do we make sure that we've got an effective pathway to bring in commercial technology? And I'll touch on that next. You can see this second bullet point. 11 of the 14 modernization priorities of DoD rely on commercial innovation, but we don't necessarily have the programs and policies in place that support that. And then we're particularly challenged at DIU, facing some budget difficulty because the Congress gave us in fiscal year 21 a record budget, but because it takes almost 3 years to get $1 of spending programmed at DoD, the budget for the subsequent year we're in now, FY22, didn't reflect the increases in 21. That's because Congress doesn't pass the budget on time. We were 6 months late with the FY21 budget. FY22 was almost on the hill, ready for their consideration. So just some of the difficulties we face in keeping up with the incredible demand we see at DIU. Well, let's go to the last part of this, which is I wanted to give you a feel for something we're advocating so that commercial technology can go faster. Let's go to the next slide. We call it fast follower strategy. So it starts with recognizing that commercial tech is different from buying a tank, a traditional defense platform. Why? Volume is different. Speed, the introduction of products is much faster. This technology is not developed for a specific service. I mentioned that earlier. We're using communications technologies, but iPhone's not developed for the Navy versus the Air Force. And maybe the most important one, so the reason that's important is we don't know where to buy it. You have to, in the Department of Defense, say who's going to buy it, so that group starts to budget for it. And maybe most important, we don't control where the technology is used. I mentioned this before. Technology diffusion in the commercial world is global. So if we don't jump on these technologies, our adversaries might have them and we don't. So what do we do about that? Well, we need to rethink, if we go to the next slide, that this process was put in place of how we bring in capability in the McNamara era. So Secretary McNamara brought the best of Ford Motor Company to the Defense Department in 1961. We need to change how he imagined we bring in capability, which basically relies on these three interlocking processes. Requirements, I talked about that before. That's where we tell the market what to build. Acquisition, mostly using the Federal Acquisition Regulation, or FAR. It's every bit as cumbersome as it sounds. And then budgeting, this fact I mentioned before, we can't take advantage of new technology, or we can't address emerging threats if it takes us 2.5 years to spend $1. We've got to move on a faster schedule than that and have more agility. So what do we do about that? Next slide. We need to divide what we're spending, what we're acquiring, into two categories. Some will continue to be what I call first mover. This is borrowed from the tech world. Most tech companies want to be a first mover. There's technology that's defense specific where that's the case. More and more we need commercial technology where that's not the case. We're not developing it. So there we need to be a fast follower. And you can see on that far right column, the technology examples there, many of them where we need the technology, we're not going to be leading in the development. So if we go to the last slide, it talks about what do we need to change to basically implement this. And you see some examples of the commercial technology, the small drones, the small satellites, and what we're seeing not deployed yet, but electric vertical takeoff and landing, these almost completely silent autonomous aircraft that could be lifting cargo or taking troops from place to place. So the first thing is you have to decide who in the Defense Department is going to buy the commercial technology. I call that dedicated organizational home. Then that organization needs to budget for it and think about building the expertise there where you continually refresh the technology. We don't do that today. We look to qualify one vendor with one requirement or one specification and then buy that for decades. That doesn't work well with commercial technology that's being refreshed so much faster. In acquisition, we need to apply some of the best practices that DIU has pioneered. I won't go through that alphabet soup, but there are some things that we've done that are on the more innovative side of acquisition versus using federal acquisition regulation. And last would be budget. So today we buy specific things. What we need to be buying is capability, where we say, I need small drones. I'm not going to specify as the Congress that we're buying that quadcopter from one vendor, Skydio, and buy that for 20 years. But if I know I need that capability, I could give you a budget for drones and have you qualify the best that's available at any point in time, and then refresh that. That allows us to get the latest technology to the warfighter, benefit from commercial technology, improvement of platforms, so that the development of that technology for the military didn't stop the day I started purchase, which is the way it does for military gear. And I'm able to make the taxpayer dollar go further because I'm buying commercial instead of something that's bespoke. So those are the kind of improvements we need to make so that the military has the best of commercial technology. I think that's the, just a summary here. DoD can modernize better with more commercial technology. We've reformed a lot within the Congress on what can be done with acquisition practices. We need to extend that now to the other legs of the stool, requirements and budget. And this will help us draw on that tremendous number of suppliers out there that make up the national security innovation base. So with that, let me stop and I think we have some time for your questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mike. You've done an impressive job there. Thank you for that. It's around time we start to, I think, alter the way the military has gone about, building its capabilities. It all comes down to a handful of contractors. You help them get away from that. Yeah, so Akri, you probably know who's on the call. I didn't have a chance to get the list who has the questions. So Akri, do you want to call on some of the people? Hello,
yes,
Mike.
Jack. So first it's going to be Mr. Melnick, who's our board member.
Hey,
First of all, thank you very much. I don't know if you can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
The technology that we are today is beyond our mind. That every day there's new technology. The cost of that and what the economy is today, how is it going to affect and what will it cost the consumer with taxes, or what's going to be in order to come to that level of security?
So do you mean making sure what we buy is more secure? Do you mean how do we afford the technology we need?
Exactly.
Yeah. So this is where I think commercial is our friend. I think because these technologies like digital wearables that I'm wearing today, or the small drones, so this won't do everything we need for the military. We're still going to need to buy a few large ships and planes. So don't take my comments as saying we don't need those things, but we need to be complementing that capability. We probably can't afford all of those we need, but we can complement them with autonomous systems. And in doing so, we stretch the taxpayer dollar further. So not only is the capability less expensive than buying these big, large platforms, but we bring additional capability that we wouldn't even get with the large platforms. Let me give you an example. So the Navy's now experimenting with autonomous systems because the Pacific is a large place. There's no way, whether you have 355 ships or 500 ships, you're going to be able to cover the Pacific with what you'd like to have. This is why space is so important. We've got to increase our field of view and new technologies like synthetic aperture radar to be able to sense what's around us. But to have capability on the closer to the surface of the Earth, the Navy's experimenting with autonomous systems that are in the air, drones. On the surface, you saw that picture of sail drone a moment ago, a solar-powered surface sailboat, and then below water, so underwater. So much less expensive than a manned vehicle, and that gives you reach to provide those sensors in so many more places than I'd be able to afford with manned ships. We're actually increasing the capability at lower cost. Those are the kind of ideas we need to be implementing so that we can stretch the taxpayer dollar further. We already are at some pretty high defense budgets approaching $800 billion. So unrealistic to think that's going to go up to 1.6 trillion. We need to be making better use of that 800 billion. And a lot of that making better use comes from these commercial technologies. We're not taking advantage of that to the extent that we could. Just an example of that, in the time that we've been around at DIU, we've made possible about $5 billion of revenue for the, over 100 new vendors we brought in place. In that same time period of $5 billion, the Defense Department's bought $1 trillion worth of military gear. So we are just a drop in the bucket. We're only scratching the surface on what the military could be doing with commercial technology. That's how we make it more affordable.
Our competitors, or I don't want to call enemies, but our competitors, where are they compared to today with us? Are we above them? Our technology is better than them?
I'd say we're categorically better than the Russians, and even they've surprised us with what a poor job they've done, thank goodness. But you're really seeing a 20th century industrialized force hampered by the problems of corruption and a conscripted force versus a voluntary force that the Russians are lying to about why they're fighting and where they're going. So you see all of that, but the gear they're fielding is not the latest. And it's a 20th century industrialized force, as I say, against a very tech-savvy force using some asymmetric capabilities like better satellite imagery, drones, more secure communications. We all remember the number of Russian generals that used their cell phone and didn't realize that's a geolocating device. So not very smart to be using that. You might find something nasty surprise coming your way. So those are just some examples of where you see their level of tech deployment. So I'm not saying they're completely backwards and not to be feared, but I feel like the US has superior capability there.
China?
China is a different story. They are ahead of us with a number of technologies. We may have invented hypersonics, but they have deployed far more hypersonic missiles than we have. That we're working furiously to try and catch up there. They are ahead of us with small drones. Chinese companies have 70% of the market for small drones. That's why DIU spent a good part of its resources in an initiative we call Blue UAS. How do we reinvigorate US and allied sources of drones and drone components? I'd say we probably have an edge in space, but some folks who've studied that, including the Space Force, Air Force Research Laboratory, and DIU, believe that if we don't make more investments in space technology over the next decade, the Chinese could get an advantage. They've done more rocket launches than we have last year and the year before that. So they're being very aggressive with space. So without walking through 10 more technologies, I would say on balance, the US still has a technology edge. The beautiful thing about the US is we have allies working with us as well. The Chinese and Russians don't have that, but they are giving us a run for our money. And that's what we need to make sure we're investing in our future. I was delighted to see the CHIPS and Science Act. We need to be doing more of that as a country. And in the space race with the Soviets in the 1960s, we were spending 2% of our GDP on federally funded R&D. And these are the things, think about what came out of the space race: software, modern software, advanced computing power, miniaturized electronics, GPS, the internet. Look how that's fueled economic prosperity in our country for the subsequent decades. That 2% of GDP that we saw is now down to 0.35. Good news, our GDP's grown, but that's not the profile of a country that's investing in its future as far as I'm concerned. I'd love to see more R&D spending. Only the federal government really has the risk profile to be investing in uncertain technologies and one that might take a decade to come to fruition. That's the kind of profile we need to be able to ensure we've got the right technologies invested in, the breakthroughs that we could produce so that we can be prosperous in the 2030s, 40s, and 50s.
God willing, we should live that long.
Well, we're all planning on our grandchildren living that long.
Well, I
Okay, Michael, we gotta get others to ask a question. Forgive us.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Akri. Thank you.
So the next question is from Mr. Dan Rosen, who is a board member of the American Jewish Congress.
And put your mic up, Dan.
I can't hear you, Dan. Not yet.
Technology.
Nope.
No. Akri, Wiley's figuring it out. Does you got another question there?
Yes, so we actually have a question from Mr. Andriy Sadovi, who's the mayor of Lviv.
Hello, good afternoon, good morning.
Hello, Mayor, it's Jack Rosen. How are you?
Fine. Thank you for possibility to have conversation with you. Great presentation, very nice. But I told about situation in Lviv. Lviv, very nice city, capital of culture of Ukraine, capital of IT of Ukraine. 10 years ago, Lviv hosted a European football champion, but today Lviv, huge hub for IDPs. 5 million IDPs passed through Lviv during Russian invasion. Today Lviv hosts 150,000 IDPs, and every day Lviv hosted new wounded, civilian wounded, military wounded. And Lviv, huge IT city. But I need advice. I look for partner for building in Lviv manufacture of prosthetics, It is my target built in Lviv, ecosystem rehabilitation unbroken. It is very, very important, but I expect then thousand people will need new prosthetics and million people needs different rehabilitation, psychological, physical, social, and I built ecosystem rehabilitation. But very interesting puzzle, it is prosthetics. And maybe you recommend me good partners for build in Lviv manufacture and prosthetics. And next message, we have a very nice IT specialist in Lviv, and we have in Lviv private manufacture, military manufacture, and we want to build a cluster, a military innovation cluster. And we need a good partner, good advice. Thanks.
Well, thank you for the question. And, you know, let me say, since we haven't met, my tremendous admiration for what your country is doing in mounting its defense. And I know, you know, all of us in the US are cheering you on. So on the prosthetics, I don't have a recommendation for you here in the call, but it is something we might be able to help with if we get a US military partner to sponsor this. So your conversations with European Command or EUCOM, if they're aware of this, they can ask us to undertake this as a project, which would mean we'd go out to the commercial market and say what's available.
Okay.
And, you get a chance to see how could we make some of what's available in commercial technology and prosthetics around the world available to you. So we'd love to see that happen. We would need EUCOM to help us with that. That's the way Defense Innovation Unit works, is we have to have a military sponsor within the Department of Defense. On the Military Innovation Center, it's something I think we could do two ways. One, I know California, the state of California, where we're headquartered, our National Guard is the partner of Ukraine, and we have a number of folks who work together there since we've been training and advising your folks in Ukraine for the last several years. So that's one path we could take through the partnership there and working with the state of California Military Department. And the other is to reach out to DIU. You could send me an email, I could get it forwarded. That's michael@diu.mil, so that while I've left the Defense Innovation Unit last week, we are working to try and increase our international engagement, and I can put you in touch with the person that's leading that. We'd be happy to sit down with you and talk about what we've done to basically build the Defense Innovation Unit over the last 7 years.
Thank you. I send you my email, and welcome to Ukraine, welcome to Lviv. I think together we create a good future for United States and my country. But thank you for huge support from United States. You see last days nice result, your support. Thank you.
We're all excited about your counteroffensive, so Godspeed with that.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. Good to see you again. I was going to call you about the prosthetics.
Okay, thanks.
Done a little homework. I'll call you in the next few days. Michael, what was your email address again?
It's michael@diu.mil. And that will be
MIL?
.mil, so .mil for .military. So
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, Akri, go ahead.
I'd like to go back to Mr. Dan Rosen if he's.
Are you able to hear me now?
we
Yes.
can.
Great. Apologies for boring. Michael, thank you for that presentation. It was incredibly interesting. A quick question from a legislative standpoint: are there things Congress can do that would help the initiatives that you are trying to build?
Absolutely. So the biggest area where Congress can help is flexibility on the budgeting. So today, the way the budget works is about 10,000 line items that they give us an up or down. They can increase, decrease. And today you have unelected staffers on congressional committees making trade-off decisions for the military on what gear should be bought. And I really think that should be the Defense Department deciding with a certain pot of money what they should be buying, not individual congressional staffers saying, no, we can't let go of a program because it provides jobs in district. So one is reforming the budgeting process to allow more flexibility. So not 10,000 light items, fewer, and give the Defense Department more responsibility for where that goes. Yes, that means giving up a little bit of control, but I think we get some better decisions from that. Number two, I think they could be encouraging more use of the kind of acquisition means that we're using at DIU. So we've got a training program. They could be helping us to grow that bigger. They could be making statements about the expanding DIU. And of course, there's always some budget help that helps us. We're limited now in our budget by the number of people that we've been able to hire. And actually, our budget has gone down in recent years because we got great support in fiscal year 21 that then, because it takes Congress so long to do a budget, the president's budget for 22 was already almost on the hill. So some help looking at the budget. All those things would be tremendous help.
Thank you.
How much more time we have, Akri, Mike?
So we have about 8 more minutes, and we have a question from Miss Corson from our audience. Miss Carson, we can't hear you. I think you're muted.
Okay, now can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
now yes.
Okay, it's a pleasure to be with you, and we appreciate the opportunity to interact with you. So I just have a question about the speed of developing technology, because sometimes there are new ideas that come in before the technology the Defense Department has bought has been produced. One example is the chips. The whole country is now gearing up to produce chips involving lithium and other precious metals. But now there are new innovations that might make that obsolete before the factories are even in operation. And that could also be true with drones. Drones aren't very old. It's like a decade or two. But before the military is finished procuring everything on its shopping list, there could be another innovation. So I was wondering if your plan for defense could include innovations and somehow not waste money. Thank you.
Right. Well, Lisa, that's a very good question. And it really speaks to the fact that technology moves so fast, we can't think we're going to predict the future and be able to buy something that's going to be on the shelf for a very long time. So that requires a different way of operating. The tech world tells us how to do that. It's move where cycle time is critically important, and you got to have the agility to adapt. So those are very different motions for the US military, but we need to get there. And from a procurement or acquisition standpoint, it means we can't plan on having the same thing around for decade after decade. You probably have to do that with aircraft carriers. You're not going to be replacing them every year. But for commercial technology, and we need to be buying more commercial technology, we need to be thinking about these refresh cycles. So that's going to make sure the latest is fielded to the warfighter, and that we are planning on upgrading that as new innovations come to play. So it's all about the cycle time and the expectations of how fast we can refresh. Most of the major procurement programs for the military have what's called a sustainment tail. 70% of what we spend in the military is maintaining old equipment rather than what the initial purchase price is. So good news with commercial technology, we can put that on its end. Who's thinking about their sustainment strategy for the iPhone? Ridiculous. You're going to replace that, and you're not going to plan to keep your iPhone 4 around for a decade. That's the kind of mentality we need to adopt in the military, that while there are certain classes of goods we keep around for a long time, an aircraft carrier, an F-35, everything else we're upgrading. And that would make sure we're not caught by surprise with new innovations.
Akri, yeah, before the session is over, I've got 1 or 2 quick questions. So,
Yes, Jack, you may ask a question, and then the director can wrap it up.
okay. So I've got 2 questions. You know, one question is, besides going to Congress, which is not a very friendly environment for people trying to make change, who else should we be talking to? How else can we make this matter other than going to the media? Who are the key players in this besides the Congress?
The companies that are producing innovative solutions. There's trade associations like National Venture Capital Association that could be more active with the Congress. We have good relationship with them, but I like to see them more active with the Congress. And then I would say also the companies themselves. It makes a tremendous difference if you've got a drone supplier and they're talking to their congressman about what could be done, how much they could be modernizing. The company that you saw Sail Drone there, located in Alameda, California, I advise them the same thing. If they want to talk to their congressperson, they're going to get a different level of attention. So that's.
Can I contact you at some point in the near term?
Sure.
Get some ideas from you, because
we
support a lot of things. People will hear us out. Doesn't mean we always succeed, but we think it's critically important. And I'd like to see if we can't be helpful in some ways.
That would be great.
Some ideas on op-eds we could write, things of that sort, to start getting some of this moving. So I get you at this email address. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah. And we'll send you an article that Representative Mike Gallagher just wrote on this topic. So there is the good news. There is a conversation that's occurring here.
So I'll send you an email with my contact information.
Excellent.
So
I appreciate everybody's interest today in this topic.
Yeah. So the other question is this. It's the one nobody wants to ask. Israel's survival is dependent on its advanced military capabilities. We are all thinking that new technologies, cyber warfare, AI, space, could basically put Israel in a position where they're militarily not any more capable in those arenas than Iran or some of the other parties in that neighborhood. Would you agree with those who say that this technology will upend warfare in the Middle East? Is that too far off in the future?
What do you mean by upend?
Well, look, there isn't a whole big difference between shutting down every utility, including water, electricity, and everything else in the state of Israel, than there is throwing a nuclear,
I see.
bomb on Tel Aviv. You're just going to blow up the country one way or the other. Maybe fewer deaths, but not easy to we can survive a couple of water plants that don't work, but countries like Israel, and we have other friends in the neighborhood, can't survive that. So is this something that's on your horizon? Is it something we should worry about? Is this so far off that we can sit back and wait and see what the future looks like?
On our horizon, definitely worried about it. So what you're really talking to is a trend that we've seen now. I used to be the CEO of Symantec. At the time, it was the world's biggest cyber company. Cyber can now deliver kinetic effects. And we saw that with Stuxnet, where that was, a capability brought to the Iranians to deliver an effect physically through cyber. Very dangerous technology. And unfortunately, it's when you say upend, it's an additional threat vector. It's not something that replaces other threat vectors. So you've got to make sure you've got as much protection as you can from cyber vulnerabilities. We talked about that in the example we gave where the Defense Department's information network is being defended in a better way and using commercial technology. But unfortunately, it's just another form of warfare that now the world is more engaged in because there are not physical consequences yet of deploying cyber warfare. There may be in the future, and as that doctrine becomes clearer, maybe that'll be more of a deterrent for some of the folks deploying these offensive cyber tools.
And is our Defense Department working on this? Is this It's a program that we're heavily engaged in.
Very, very much so. The establishment of the newest combatant command is Cybercom. I take that back. Space Command is probably a little more recent than that, but one of the newest combatant commands is recognizing this is a new domain of warfare, and the person leading that, General Nakasone, has responsibility for offensive cyber. So he never is able to talk about that very much, but he has a new doctrine in place, which is about persistent engagement or deploying forward. That means we're not going to sit back and wait and just be defenders in this new domain. We're going to be out engaging the enemy and creating some havoc for those folks who are constantly creating havoc for us in cyberspace. So we've helped him with some of the tools that he's using. And I think that's made a big difference. And that's just something new in the last about 4 years, is the fact that we're going to be persistently engaged with adversaries that are trying to wreak havoc here using cyber warfare.
Okay. All right. I'm going to let you go on. I want to thank you, Mike, for a very interesting session. I look forward to talking to you about some of this stuff, seeing how we might help. And, you know, I don't know where you're going, but maybe we can help you as well. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you to all those who joined us today. And